Okay, so for my document review, I decided to look at two different parent handbooks, and these are often things that are given to prospective parents who are looking to enroll their children in early childhood educational institutions. So I looked at a Christian academy in Minnesota and an early childhood laboratory facility associated with Langston University in Oklahoma. And the reason that I chose these was because the site that I'm actually looking at encompasses children ages 3 to 5 because my research very much looks at regulating challenging behaviors of children in that age group and how teachers sort of articulate their processes, their philosophies, and how they go about doing it, and whether they feel supported by the administration. So I think part of the administrative factor was why I chose to do parent handbooks, because how you market to parents is oftentimes policy isn't doesn't exist unless you write it down. So oftentimes I looked at a few different factors of how these administrators and the stakeholders, because oftentimes parents are part of the community or stakeholders of making these policies. I wanted to look at a few different factors. One, I wanted to look at staff to child ratios because research suggests that the lower the staff to child ratios, the more effective interventions for regulating challenging behavior are. I looked at accreditation for each one of those, which it looked like was actually very interesting, because one of them that had the more detailed policy for listing out actual disciplinary practices was actually the one that was not accredited by the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is sort of like the top shelf accreditor in that educational part of the field. So I found that very interesting. I also found that a lot of the language didn't focus the spectrum that sort of encompasses challenging behaviors. So, for instance, the Christian Academy itself had a very detailed, they had a inviting policy, they had a student code of conduct and expectations, and they even had an acronym of what students were expected to do. Whereas the one that was attached to an early childhood laboratory to Langston University actually had a very sparse 2 sentences talking about how they would positively reinforce children and redirect their behavior, but they don't detail like what the practices are. They don't market how professionalized or the certification of their teachers in either of those, which is important, because if you are theoretically going to be recruiting um, children into this high quality early education environment, you would very much probably want to focus that, like your staff and teachers have a focus in early childhood education. So I was a little perplexed by the lack of detail, because I'm not a parent, but if I were going to send my young child to this, I would want to know like what the expectations are, what the policies and procedures were, and the staff to child ratios, because I would want my child to get personal attention, be talked to, be taught all of the things in different units, and specifically the educational status, because I'd want a high professionalization or a focus, because the site that I'm going to be looking at specifically requires that employees and staff have, or at least lead teachers anyway, have a specialization in early childhood. So I think looking at those different factors and how these two different ones looked at different service different age groups, like the one at Langston University very much serviced like a 0 to early threes, and then the Minnehaha Academy in Minneapolis actually only went from 3 to 4. So I think that also was interesting to look at the different spectrum of ages, and maybe the one that is focused less on later 3 and 4s doesn't need a more articulated policy, because challenging behaviors don't get to be that disruptive, because the gross and fine motor development of those children, developmentally speaking, maybe isn't at the point where you need to have a detailed practice, because they don't have the sort of cognitive and neurological ability to sort of articulate themselves and be disruptive in a way that 3 or 4 year olds are. So that was just what I was thinking of. That's what I got away from it. But I very much think that parent handbooks are a good resource to sort of look at standards and practices, and also how programs like this sort of present themselves to members of the community as they're trying to get children into their programs.